Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Hello, and welcome to episode 229 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. On March 5, 1770, during the evening, a crowd in Boston surrounded a sentry on guard at the Custom House. Testimony varies as to why they gathered, but we know from historical sources that the crowd was not an innocent one. Its members carried clubs, cutlasses, snowballs, and aimed to provoke the soldier. Now, the crowd's provocation had its intended effect, even if it brought unintended consequences. The soldier and the compatriots who came to his aid reacted to the crowd's goading and fired their muskets. 5 crowd members died. Within days of the shooting, Boston town officials wrote and published a pamphlet to relay their version of events, which they described as the Horrid Massacre. And engravers Paul Revere and Henry Pelham both printed a similar image. It portrayed an officer standing behind 8 to 10 of his men and giving the order to fire into a well-assembled and peaceful crowd. These are just some of the ways Bostonians politicized the Boston Massacre. And their version of events has always seemed to depict elements of a conspiracy or a design on the part of the British government to do them harm. But why? What was going on within the larger British Empire that agitated colonists to the point where they were provoking armed soldiers in Boston streets and seeing nefarious designs in the actions of the British government? And how did the British government get to the point where it felt that it had no other choice but to station as many as 2,000 soldiers in Boston during peacetime? A decision that ultimately pitted imperial soldiers and colonial Britons against each other. Patrick Griffin joins us to seek answers to these questions and to continue our 3-episode series investigating the Boston Massacre. Patrick is a professor of history at the University of Notre Dame. He's also the author of The Townshend Moment, The Making of Empire and Revolution in the 18th Century. Patrick is going to help us widen our view of the Boston Massacre by helping us better understand what was going on within the British Empire around 1770. Now, as we investigate the imperial context of the Boston Massacre, Patrick reveals details about the Townshend Moment, information about the British Empire and how it functioned after the French and Indian or 7 Years' War, and the Townshend Plan for imperial and colonial reform. But first, as you may have heard, Ben Franklin's World has new custom music. Speaking of which, did you listen to the very end of last week's episode for our special musical tribute to Ben Franklin? If you didn't, you should listen for it today because it's pretty neat. Anyway, the new music is part of the Omohundro Institute's ongoing commitment to this show. To this end, the OI supported the creation of a brand new look for the podcast and the composition of custom music for the show. Music that honors the early American past while also acknowledging our 21st century present. Okay, are you ready to explore the larger context of the Boston Massacre? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian. Our guest is the Madden Hennebree Family Professor of History and the director of the Keough Naughton Institute of Irish Studies at the University of Notre Dame. His research explores the intersections of colonial American and early modern Irish and British history. He's the author of 4 books, including American Leviathan, Empire, Nation, and the Revolutionary Frontier, and, most recently, The Townshend Moment, The Making of Empire and Revolution in the 18th Century. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Patrick Griffin.
Liz, great to be here. Thank you.
So, we're here to talk about the American Revolution. Specifically, we're here to investigate the world and context the revolution took place in. And part of that world was something that Patrick has described as the Townshend Moment. Patrick, I wonder if you would set the scene of this moment for us. What was the state of the British Empire after the French and Indian or 7 Years' War ended in 1763? And what was this Townshend Moment and why did it emerge?
Well, I'll use this one word, momentous. 1763 was a momentous year. In other words, it was of a moment. This was a year when British people in particular were struck by the promise, but also the uncertainty that they were facing at this particular moment. They now had the greatest territorial empire the world had ever seen. They were struggling with unprecedented levels of debt. And so because of this, this was a time of great peril, but it was also a time of unbelievable opportunity. And this in many ways captures, if you will, the zeitgeist at this particular moment of time. More or less, Britons at this time believed they were sharing in something, a moment when there was a new world aborning. This was a window. This was a watershed. This was a tipping point in history. And this is the way that some people at the time articulated it. And particularly the two people that I study, Charles and George Townshend. They were convinced that this was a moment of time for them to step onto the stage and to do something wonderful.
Did all Britons see themselves as part of this momentous period after the British victory in the 7 Years' War? Or was this feeling really just limited to Britons who lived in the United Kingdom?
No, I think all Britons did. And so through popular culture at the time, people throughout the British Isles, of course, certainly embraced this conceit. But also people in British North America did as well. People lit bonfires. Bells tolled. People believed at this time that they were part of something much, much larger than themselves, and something that was part of the fabric of history, when some old world, if you will, was sort of vanishing, and now they all saw the possibilities of the new world. And people were convinced that this new world was British, and Americans of all people were thrilled with the prospects of being part of that new world.
Now, you mentioned that you've studied two people who were at the center of this momentous period, George and Charles Townshend. Who were the Townshend brothers, and how did they view the British Empire before the 7 Years' War and before their Townshend moment?
Well, I think the best way to think about the two brothers, Liz, is that they were two very different sorts of halves, but very complementary halves. And let me just tell you a little bit of something about their personalities, because I do think it tells us a great deal about how they understood their roles in this particular moment. Charles was by far, I would say, the brighter of the two, although George was very bright himself. But Charles was brilliant. He had a nimble mind. But the flip side of that is that he could be whimsical at times. George, however, could be extraordinarily firm. And when he decided on a certain position, he had an iron will to more or less kind of hold the course. But at the same time, he could be overly stubborn. And he could also browbeat his brother at times to try to get him to follow his particular kinds of wishes. For a long period of time, the two brothers more or less kind of lived their lives alone. It was just because their parents had separated. One lives with the mother and one lives with the father. And so although they knew of each other, they certainly didn't get to know each other very well until they really became adults. And it's that point where these two complementary halves come together. And that's the way they consciously saw themselves. They saw themselves as in a partnership around the time of the 7 Years' War. And they believed that they had to work together to achieve any sort of vision that they would come up with.
And to illustrate your point about the brothers being complementary, both George and Charles Townshend chose to work for the British government prior to the 7 Years' War. But they had two very different jobs. So I wonder if you would tell us why they chose government service and about the different types of work they did.
Yeah, they largely came to because of patronage networks. So both of these brothers, even though they're envisioning the possibilities of a new world, they are coming to power through old school kinds of ways. And it was more or less who you knew. They came from a family that was extraordinarily well connected. And so immediately when they get out of university, they both went to Cambridge. And then after that, they both take their own grand tour. When they do, they have all sorts of visions for the kinds of positions they're going to take. And eventually Charles settles, and that's the way he thought about it. He settles for a position with the Board of Trade. George, however, has a very different apprenticeship than Charles. George will actually join the army while he's taking his grand tour in Europe. And then he's going to cut his teeth as an officer in the British Army, fighting first in the War of Austrian Succession.
So Charles thought he was settling for position on the Board of Trade? I mean, I guess we have the luxury of hindsight, but as you wrote in your book, The Townshend Moment, Charles really does seem to have secured a great position on the Board of Trade because he learned a lot from Lord Halifax. So would you tell us about Lord Halifax, the Board of Trade, and what Charles learned from Halifax?
Yeah, well, he was somebody else to really work with because Halifax was nothing short of a visionary. The Board of Trade was kind of like a think tank for the empire. It didn't so much formulate policy as it tried to kind of manage the flows across the ocean, tried to come up with data that would allow people to understand and appreciate how the empire should ideally function and how trade should ideally be managed, how the various governments in this rabbit warren of kind of British sovereignty that was the empire, how these rabbit warrens had to function together, ultimately to try to help the whole. but they didn't more or less kind of decide on how the empire was going to function. What Halifax wanted to do was turn it into a little bit something more. And he realized early on, really in the years before the 7 Years' War, that the British Empire was going to struggle until it could somehow reshape its empire and get the empire to function as a whole. So he came up with different plans, and he asked Charles to help him develop some of these plans for potentially how empire could work in a more centralized, more efficient, more systematic manner. And so as Charles is learning the ropes about how the empire functions, how trade flows, how money works through this world, he is very fortunate indeed to be working with someone like Halifax, who, as I said before, is such a visionary.
Why exactly did Halifax believe that the British Empire would struggle unless it could be reformed? Would you tell us about how the British Empire functioned?
Well, I think this goes to the nature of the world that they confronted at the time. I mean, the best way of thinking about the Atlantic in the 18th century was a world that was extraordinarily entangled, a world that was growing by leaps and bounds, that was becoming much more integrated than it had before. But this was a dizzying kind of place. And as statesmen looked out in particular, and as wars were being fought in the 18th century, they realized that unless they could somehow reform this space and harness its potential, states were going to be butting up against one another, states would be warring with one another. But the state that could fix and manage the Atlantic was the state that was not only going to survive, but was going to thrive in the much more competitive 18th century.
Your point about the 18th century Atlantic world being an entangled world is a really important one. And so we can better understand this point, how exactly did the British imperial and Atlantic trade work during the time that Charles Townshend came to work for the Board of Trade? I mean, what was this trade like before the 7 Years' War?
Well, think about it this way. Over the course of the 18th century, there's an unprecedented flow of people, goods, and ideas that are moving across the Atlantic, moving across what is increasingly becoming an integrated, networked web. Trade in and of itself was something that wasn't all that much regulated. Now, it was regulated technically in the sense that the Navigation Act stipulated that, say, goods coming and going from Britain had to be shipped in British bottoms. The British, of course, could impose tariffs as they saw fit when it came to trade from other kinds of places. And the colonies were beholden to the mother country when it came to kind of setting trade policy. But here's the thing. So many people ignored everything that was down on paper, and the Atlantic was increasingly becoming a free-for-all as people realized that it was very easy to evade the acts that were put in place and also evade authorities. And this was part of the problem. The part of the problem is that it was a space that on paper should have been regulated, but it was a space that no state had the capacity or the will to regulate. And then what you find is people in different parts of the empire are becoming enriched in ways they hadn't before. You find a rise of a whole Creole elite in North America and in the Caribbean who are increasingly making their money off of this integrated and entangled space. Now, that was a problem as far as statesmen in Britain were concerned, but it was also an extraordinary opportunity, getting back again to the momentous nature of the moment. If they could harness this potential, if they could manage the flows, they were the ones that were going to inherit the earth.
So if the Atlantic was a chaotic and disorganized, entangled place before the French and Indian or 7 Years' War, how did that war change or impact the ways that colonists and others were ignoring the British Empire's price regulations on trade? I mean, did the war impact how people used and profited from this entangled world?
Think about the 7 Years' War this way. Of course, it's history's first global war. It was fought on every known continent at the time. But its real focus was on the Atlantic, and it's the first time that North America becomes a central theater of operations for a European war. So what you find is, if you will, the American tail is wagging the European dog. And this was representative of how the Atlantic had become such an important space at the time and how much more important colonies were at the time than they were before. So to a certain extent, the 7 Years' War is kind of the apogee of that systematization of the Atlantic space that was occurring over the course of the 18th century. It was the high point of everything that occurred up to that point. But what the 7 Years' War does also, it becomes the high point of so much of the smuggling that is going on. New York merchants, for example, are trading with the French, with the enemies of the British, because warfare gives you that many more options of doing things like smuggling. And even though they would regard themselves as patriotic Britons to a certain extent, they didn't let that get in the way of business.
To bring this back to the Townsends now, what was Charles Townshend's involvement with the Board of Trade during the 7 Years' War? I mean, it seems clear that his learning from Halifax and being witness to rampant smuggling before and during the war would have helped turn him and many other Britons into a proponent of American reform. But did he do anything else that helped turn him into the architect of American reform that we remember him as?
Well, Charles, first and foremost, was a master of trade. And Charles cut his teeth kind of with this group, the Board of Trade. And he was noted to be one of its great experts on trade. At the time of the 7 Years' War, though, he found himself really kind of on the sidelines for a while, and that was because of an indiscretion of his brother George. His brother George had infuriated one of the leading politicians of Britain at the time, and because of that then was cast into the political wilderness, and because Charles was conjoined with him, he was as well. So throughout much of the early part of the war, he didn't have a role to play. He came in toward the end of the war, Secretary of War, and when he did so, again, he was largely managing the flows of people and materiel to various parts of the globe so that the British could manage the war at that time.
Okay, so after the 7 Years' War, Great Britain would try to reform and rein in all that smuggling and free-for-all that was its Atlantic trade, as well as other aspects of its now really large empire. Patrick, what did Great Britain stand to gain by reforming the ways its empire traded and worked? And would you tell us about some of the methods of reform that it pursued?
Well, they hope to gain a great deal. As I said before, they hope to kind of harness the potential, but this isn't exactly the way that they were putting it at the time. So many people felt that really they were in desperate straits, particularly with the debt. That gets back to kind of the momentous nature of the 7 Years' War, how much this is a moment of promise, but also a moment of potential peril. Now, the first stabs at doing so, Sugar Act is going to be an attempt to enforce all laws on the books. The Stamp Act is really the first time where officials are going to say, wow, we really have to act here and we have to come up with some sort of notion of reform to try to make this empire actually work for the center in some kind of way. Now, the Stamp Act itself was a blunt instrument. And the idea that it was just not so much to kind of extract money that would go to the center, but at least the money that was going to be raised through the stamp duty was going to allow the British to defray some of the costs from having the military stationed on American soil, because they now had a vast frontier that they had to defend against the French, whom they figured were going to be kind of back in the fray before too long. So the Stamp Act is the first stab at doing something. And if anything, it was almost an emotional impulse at the time to try to act, to do something, to try to make the empire function in some kind of way.
Nowadays, when we talk about the Stamp Act, which was passed in 1765, we talk about it in terms of a crisis. It was a crisis between Great Britain and her North American colonies. So, Patrick, could you tell us about this crisis and more about that really interesting point you made in your book, The Townshend Moment, about how we're preconditioned to view the Stamp Act as the first act in an inevitable drama about home rule versus who should rule at home?
Yeah, I think that's the way that we Americans have always seen it. And this is both professional historians, but think about the ways that you probably learned about this in grade school. We learned the litany. So you have the Sugar Act, you have the Stamp Act, you have the Declaratory Act, the Townshend Duties, Boston Massacre, Tea Act, Coercive and Tolerable Acts. It seems that act after act, something that the British are doing is going to create like this pressure cooker that's finally going to explode in places like Lexington and Concord in 1775. And so we kind of look back and say, well, where does this pressure cooker get going? And well, the pressure cooker gets going when the British turn on the fire, and the fire starts with the Stamp Act. But I think if you look around the British Atlantic world, I think you find a bit of a different story. And I think the story is this. This was a moment when the British were going to try to systematize empire, albeit in a very ham-fisted kind of way. But it was also the moment when Americans, as provincials, were going to push back. And there's nothing unusual about this. For generations, the British had tried to do this with Scotland and then with Ireland, and they would pass some sort of act, and provincials would push back. And that's the way that governance actually occurred within the empire before. So far from this being the first step in a revolution, I think what we have is this is the moment when Americans realize, oh, we're actually provincials. And this is when they start to really act like provincials, pushing back and then waiting to see what the British state will do.
That's really interesting. What exactly did it mean to act as a provincial? I mean, the colonists were Britons, so was a provincial a different type of Briton?
I think a provincial is different from a Briton because to a certain extent, they are almost like second-class subjects within the kingdom, and they sort of know it. And they feel that they want to be deemed equals equals as people like, say, who, for example, who are living in England. Now, they understand that they're not English, but they do believe that they're entitled to all the rights of an Englishman. So part of being a provincial is a recognition that one's status or kind of one's life is almost like amphibious, that you're in America and you want to be conceived of as being a Briton. And when you go to Britain, you also want to be seen maybe as something exotic, maybe as an American. And I think Americans for the first time begin to experience their lives as being provincials in very much the same way, say, members of the Irish ascendancy did and like Lowland Scots did. There were people who lived in a number of different worlds. And American provincials, like the Irish ascendancy, like Lowland Scots, were ruling over other subject populations at the same time. And so the provincial dilemma was both a bit of tension between the center and between the periphery they lived in. But for these people who happened to be Creole elites in America, it was also a dilemma over their role as kind of power brokers in their own society, always looking over their shoulders at the subject peoples around them.
Now, after the 7 Years' War, Great Britain often seemed to think that it faced a lot of different challenges to its sovereignty and authority. And after we take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor, I think we should explore those challenges. This episode is brought to you by the Omohundro Institute, proud publishers of award-winning books since 1943. Are you enjoying our wider view of the British Empire during this momentous period, the Townshend Moment? Would you like to know more about this moment? If so, you should check out the Omohundro Institute's selection of books about the British Empire. Just visit benfranklinsworld.com/OI books and then put Empire right into the search bar. When you do this, you'll find titles that investigate all sorts of Atlantic world empires and the issues they faced during the 17th and 18th centuries. So you'll find works on pirates, smuggling, and trade. You'll also find works that explore the nature of imperial identity and governance. And because you're a loyal Ben Franklin's World listener, the Omohundro Institute is offering you a special promo code, so you can purchase any title published by the OI at a 40% discount. Just use your special promo code 01DAH40. Again, save 40% off any OI book title by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/OI books and use promo code 01DAH40. I've placed the details for this listener-only sale in our show notes and in your Ben Franklin's World app. Patrick, what were some of the challenges Great Britain faced to its sovereignty and authority after the 7 Years' War? And were these challenges caused by the Americans' realization that they were in fact provincials and not equal Britons, or were these challenges caused by something else?
I think the greatest challenge they faced when it came to sovereignty was, first off, kind of how do you envision sovereignty? And that's going to be a bit of a struggle. And this is, I think, where the Townsends are going to play very, very important roles. And I think the first issue with that is that you had all sorts of contending ideas of what the sovereignty is going to look like. The one thing nearly everybody agreed upon was simply this, that Parliament was supreme. And Parliament had been supreme since the time of the Glorious Revolution. And this, in the minds of most Britons, ensured the liberty of all Britons throughout the 18th century. So that if this was going to be extended out to the provinces, Parliament was still going to be supreme. So no ifs, ands, buts about it. Now, the question then beyond that is kind of what is this parliamentary supremacy? What is this parliamentary sovereignty going to look like? Does it mean that America is just going to be kind of ruled in an offhand sort of fashion with a great deal of autonomy, just more or less doing what they were doing before, and then Parliament's providing a shell of sovereignty? Or is sovereignty going to be really meaningful? Is the empire going to become much more systematized? Is it going to be centralized? Is it going to be set up in a way that the center is ruling and determining affairs on the periphery? And what you find after the 7 Years' War, again, going back to the momentous nature of the time, is an extraordinary debate within Britain about what this empire is going to look like. And after that, then different groups of ministers are going to try to come up with different plans that are going to reflect the ways that they're thinking about sovereignty in this very fluid moment of time.
So what did Americans think about British sovereignty and Parliament's quest to extract revenue from them to support the empire?
I think Americans, too, we normally think they just had one view. There were many different views at the time. And as they're trying to grope and trying to make sense of what sovereignty should look like, too, this is not just something happening in London. It's also happening throughout much of the British Empire. In the wake of the 7 Years' War, what, say, the enactment of the Stamp Act does, it really engages all provincials in a debate about what should this empire look like? What should it be like? Now, some are going to say, hey, we owe this to Britain, they fought for us at the time of the 7 Years' War. They did us a great service. And so if they're going to centralize authority, so be it. That would be a minority perspective. Most Americans, really like all people, wanted the best of both worlds. They wanted the protection of British sovereignty. At the same time, they wanted the autonomy to lead their lives as they saw fit. By doing so, potentially for the elites that are living in society, which you could call a Creole elite, they had prospered during the 18th century. They had become wealthier. They were lords of all they surveyed in their cities and in their towns. And so they didn't want anything that was going to potentially impinge upon this autonomy. And so most of them are going to understand and appreciate that Parliament has to be supreme, so be it. But they are always going to lean on the side that even though they are supreme, we should have as much autonomy as possible.
Now, you mentioned that the Stamp Act crisis was the first time Parliament saw a real need to develop a plan for colonial reform. Was there a plan of reform built into the Stamp Act, or did that plan come after the crisis?
Not at all. That was the problem with it. Certainly as far as Charles and George were concerned. They thought that the Stamp Act itself was maybe a good idea in the sense of the impulse behind it, that we have to do something to centralize things, and also in the sense that somehow the provinces have to pony up, if you will, for empire. Their problem with it was the way that it was enacted. They thought they'd put the cart before the horse. The Townsends just simply believed that what they had to come up with is a more systematic understanding of empire. Then you had to implement something after which money could actually be extracted. So they thought first, create an empire, create a system that functions. After you have the system that functions, then you can actually get revenue from the colonies. But the Stamp Act had nothing at all to do with that. Like I said before, a blunt instrument.
So given that the Townsends were so reform-minded, as we've discussed throughout our conversation, and as you discussed in the Townshend Moment, it really sounds like the Townsends wouldn't necessarily have approved of using the Stamp Act as a blunt instrument.
Absolutely. They thought it was foolish. They thought it was a foolish measure that just would kind of incite people, understandably so. I mean, they supported it only into the extent that they believed maybe something had to be done. And also as they're courting different potential partners in what is going to be a future government as far as they're concerned. But at the end of the day, that they thought it was really kind of a foolish measure. While this is going on, the two brothers are corresponding with one another and are talking about the plans, when and if we get into power, when the moment comes for us. And they're talking about things like that, the opportunity, when we're on the stage, when we actually are able to enact some sort of vision. They believe that they have come up with that vision, and they're just waiting for the proper moment in order to do so.
And from the way you describe it, it really sounds like the Townsends believe that they had a real chance to get to a center stage place of power in government, where they could act their ideas of reform. So why did the Townsends have cause to think that they could obtain these powerful positions?
I think they had reason to hope for a couple of things. First off, there was just a literal merry-go-round of ministers at the time, and nobody seemed to have the measure of the age. And the Townsends looked out and they would look at kind of the coterie of ministers that would form said government. And they would say, for example, well, we don't think this one is going to last, or that one's not going to last. We can't see this one making it. We have to wait for a proper one to come along. Now, this may have been kind of a rationalization on their part because, again, they happened to be put out into the wilderness because of another indiscretion on George's part. But after a few years, after people forgot about that indiscretion, they realized that if they found the right group of people, that maybe they were the men that could match the moment. They were the men that could meet this momentous period of time and come up with a vision that could make the empire function.
And it does seem like the Townsends did come up with the men, because on August 2, 1766, Charles Townshend became the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Patrick, what role did the Chancellor of Exchequer play in the British government, and how was Charles even able to accede to that office?
Sure. A Chancellor of Exchequer is kind of the equivalent of a finance minister. So he takes care of all the money that's flowing through the kingdom and through the empire. And Charles, given his apprenticeship, was ideally suited for this job. This was a very powerful job, a very important job, and it was the first job of first rank that he had really had. And he jumped at the opportunity because at that time, William Pitt was given the reins of government. William Pitt was an ally of the brothers. He knew them from a long time ago. And as the brothers thought about what sort of government would be an ideal one, they always thought of William Pitt as being the leader. He is translated into Lord Chatham, the Earl of Chatham, for many of his duties for the empire before, because he had actually been the architect that had developed the British overarching strategy that had won the 7 Years' War. He had also created a lot of the debt that the British were struggling with. But when Pitt or Chatham takes over control, both brothers say, this is the moment that we've been waiting for. And so when Charles is offered the position of Chancellor of the Exchequer, he realizes that now he has this opportunity to enact a vision that he and his brother have been working on for some time.
Okay, but even still, it sounds like Charles Townshend was just Pitt's finance minister. So what powers did Charles really have that would have made it possible for him to enact his scheme for colonial reform?
He had a great many powers. There were a couple things, and there were a few contingencies that go into even making him more powerful. The first contingency is this. William Pitt, when he became the Earl of Chatham, is actually in the House of Lords. So imagine if you have somebody in the House of Lords who's supposed to be directing things in the House of Commons. You have to get someone who's going to serve, if you will, as your deputy, as your voice, as someone who's going to enact the vision you have. And that is given to Charles because of the characteristics and because of his abilities, which people said were quite extraordinary when he would get into the House of Commons. That's going to be one reason. The second reason has to do with Pitt's health. We don't quite know what he was suffering from. He had all kinds of maladies, but it seems he may have been manic depressive. He may have been suffering from some sort of anxiety. But for whatever reason, for long periods of time, he was indisposed in his townhouse in Bath. And while this is happening, Charles sees his opening, and Charles seizes control, and Charles decides to enact his vision.
Wow. It really just sounds like the British government was in a constant state of instability and quite possibly even in a state of chaos after the 7 Years' War. I mean, we've talked about a lot of turnover in high-level positions, but it also seems like for the Townsends, this is what made the Townshend Moment a reality, and it sounds like they relished this chance to come to power and create order out of this seemingly great mess.
Absolutely. But the other thing we got to remember is that there's nothing that's distinctive about the Townsends, even though they thought they were exceptional. And that's kind of a paradox that I think the book dwells on. They thought they were exceptional, but they were not distinctive. Everybody who came to power believed that they were people who could meet the moment in just the way the Townsends did. It just so happened that fate, providence, luck, call it whatever you will, conspired to allow them to take the stage at this particular moment in time.
So when the Townsends come to power in July 1766, what was their plan for imperial and colonial reform?
It's very simple. What they have to do is you have to create a systematized, centralized empire. And as far as they were concerned, first things first. While Charles is going to do things to try to integrate America more effectively, I should say that George is going to be doing the very same thing at around the same time with Ireland. He becomes Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. And as he does so, he tries to ensure that British power is going to run Ireland, that the British can determine Irish affairs finally after a long period of rule by a group that was called the Undertakers. So he takes on the responsibility of undermining these Undertakers by more or less becoming a patronage boss for all of Ireland. And as he does so, he's able to ensure that the British state is able to do whatever it can and wants for Ireland. And Ireland is critical for this because it's going to supply, he hopes, manpower for the empire. If Britain supplies the manpower, Charles thinks America is going to supply a great deal of the revenue. But you can't just collect revenue like you tried to do under the Stamp Act, just telling Americans to pay up. The problem as far as Charles was concerned was that the empire was corrupted in lots of ways. And a lot of that corruption stemmed from the fact that local assemblies had the right to determine payments for governors and other officials. And so what he wants to do is first create a structure that can allow this corruption to wither away. The Townshend duties are based not upon the idea of extracting duties or revenue from America, as ensuring a structure can be put in place so that later on revenue can be extracted.
And key to Charles's plan for imperial reform were the Townshend duties. So would you tell us more about these duties, what they were, and how the Townsends came up with this particular plan for reform?
The Townshend duties just put a duty on everyday items that were shipped over from Britain to the American colonies, such as glass, paint, lead, paper. Tea was also put in there. So these things, glass, paint, lead, paper, they're not produced in the colonies at the time. They're produced in Britain and they're shipped over to the American colonies. The taxes put on them are going to be quite small at the time. But the idea is that though these taxes are small, the money's not going to be going into Britain or anything like that. what they're going to do is that money is going to be used to pay for royal officials in America and also to pay for boards of revenue that are going to be established. When this is put in place, these officials can more or less declare their independence from assemblies. And it's at that moment that the British are going to be able to enact legislation to ensure that America is going to be subordinated. It will be a province within the empire. And America also now will pay its fair share of running that empire. So it's a very simple move as far as Charles was concerned. And he considered it to be the first move of more that were to follow.
You know, I think we could see how the British, those who lived in the British Isles, could have seen the Townshend Plan as a plan for imperial reform. But how did the American provincials view the Townshend duties as a plan of reform?
Oh boy, they were incensed by what went on. And I think that was the sort of thing that in many ways could have been expected, but it came from kind of surprising quarters. And it means that we got to step back for one moment and just cover one other thing. And that is in the wake of the Stamp Act, when Ben Franklin is called in by the Parliament and he's asked, like, what the heck is going on? Why are Americans so incensed about the Stamp Act? And of course, Franklin is famously going to say, wait a minute. It's about the kind of taxes that you're passing. You pass taxes that are more or less kind of internal taxes. It's based upon the things that Americans are producing, and this has them upset. If you pass external taxes, that is stuff that's wholly produced elsewhere and is brought over to America, well, that's a different story. All right, that's something that we know that Parliament can actually legislate for, and we're willing to accept this. Now, when he hears about this, Charles laughs. He goes, well, that's an absurdity. That's a complete absurdity. Parliament can do whatever it wants because Parliament is supreme. But he thought that if Americans were kind of more or less seeing things in this way, he could use this little conceit to create a little wedge. In other words, he could say, well, you know what? You say you're okay with external taxes? Here are some external taxes. Even though the idea wasn't to extract the revenue, it was to prop up certain new structures that were going to be put in place.
Did Franklin's view prove correct on this matter? I mean, were Americans really okay with just paying taxes on some of the goods that they were importing?
Oh, no. Americans went crazy over this. Americans were incensed about this. But as the book covers, it's not just kind of an impulsive reaction to what had gone on. I think it is a little bit different from what happened at the time of the Stamp Act for a number of reasons. Number one, I think Americans are kind of galvanized and catalyzed by a series of letters written by a writer by the name of John Dickinson. Dickinson, of course, famously writes letters of an American farmer. And these are his response to the Townshend duties. And Dickinson knows exactly what is going on. And he sees exactly what Charles is up to. And these letters are electrifying. And people all up and down the coast in America are reading them. And as they read them, they start to see that, boy, oh boy, maybe this isn't just a one-off like the Stamp Act. You know how Parliament passes the Stamp Act, we push back just like good provincials, and after that they relent? That doesn't seem to be happening here. They're passing something else. And so Americans start to make, if you will, they start to kind of make a mental shift here. And they start to see in the Townshend duties what they call design. They start to see a pattern. They start to connect dots. That's very different than what had happened before.
Yeah. So what was John Dickinson writing about in these letters, and what dots was he connecting for Americans? I mean, where did Dickinson see the design in Charles Townshend's plan?
They start to connect dots between the fact that maybe the Stamp Act is not just a one-off after all. Maybe it's part of what they call a design. Maybe there are certain designing ministers in Parliament who really do want to subjugate us. And they start using the word also enslave us at this point. The Townshend duties demonstrate to them that Parliament isn't just involved in this kind of like kabuki dance of push back and relent, push a little bit more and relent. Maybe they want to actually make Americans, if you will, second-class subjects. Indeed, that's what Charles wanted to do. So I think Dickinson has his measure. So all of these letters go through multiple editions and Americans are devouring them. And as they do so, they too seem to have a crystallized sense of what is happening. And just at this particular moment too, they also get a much firmer sense of the kind of empire they want to live in. And it's certainly not the kind of empire that Charles Townshend imagines.
So in 1765, when Parliament passed the Stamp Act, Americans responded with big, violent riots. John Bell specifically told us all about the Boston Stamp Act riots and really just how violent they were. So, how did Americans respond to the Townshend duties? Did they continue to stage big riots to show their displeasure?
What you see here is political, organized resistance. And I would say all of America is politicized by what happens from the Townshend duties. That some people were able to decry what had happened in the wake of the Stamp Act as kind of a mob violence, as people just kind of enacting the various kind of tensions and pressures that they were feeling in their society and aiming them in a certain sort of way. But when it comes down to the Townshend duties, all of these things are aimed at Britain, and they seem to be extraordinarily well coordinated. They need a great deal of coordination because the focus now is particularly upon the goods, of stopping the goods of Britain coming in and ensuring that Americans won't buy them. And this is where you start to see concerted colonial coordination to come up with some kind of plan to thwart what they do see as an overarching design to subjugate them.
Right. This is when we start to see and hear about the Americans' non-importation movements.
That's indeed when you do see that. And then non-importation, it just doesn't have to do with the goods themselves. Like I say, ultimately, this demonstrates extraordinary political capacity and also political will to act in a certain kind of way. And then what you see is, from this moment on, is normal social tensions that you see in any kind of society are increasingly channeled politically from this point forward. All becomes political in America. And everything, all protest is pointing now at sovereignty. Sovereignty is not something that is assumed. Sovereignty now becomes a political question.
So just to recap here, Charles Townshend gets his initial duties on these external goods through Parliament. They're enacted, and then John Dickinson and his fellow Americans push back against them with letters of protest and non-importation agreements. What did Charles Townshend make of this unhappy response?
Well, I think he would have been really upset with it, but he was dead. That is kind of one of the extraordinary parts of this story, is Charles doesn't live long enough to see what actually happened. So we don't know.
So what did Parliament make of the American response to Charles Townshend's plan of reform?
Oh my God, it makes them go back to the drawing board. That's what they have to do. And so what you're going to find at this point, again, is they're going to do what they did at the Stamp Act. And so what they're going to go is they are going to roll back everything that had been passed before, with the exception of the tax on tea, because of how difficult the situation had become because of these politicized and organized protests that they saw going on. And so they start scratching their heads and they start to say, what the heck have we stirred? We've stirred a hornet's nest. So that's one thing that they're going to do. Another thing that they're going to do is they're going to start marching in troops. And they're going to start marching in troops to say that we have to somehow prop up law and order in this society, that if we claim to be sovereign over America, we have to demonstrate that sovereignty in a certain sort of way. And this is when America is politicized. It also becomes militarized at this point.
You mentioned that Parliament repealed all the Townshend duties except the duty on tea. What was that about?
Well, I think that's about that. Tea is, of course, not made in Britain. It's traded through Britain, but it's from the East India Company. So it's actually tea that's grown in China, that's brought in by the ships of the East India Company, that's brought into warehouses in England, and these then are transshipped to America. So these were more or less seen as different than the other sorts of duties that are imposed, the things that are wholly manufactured in Britain at the time. But, we're going to see this later on much clearly when it comes to the Tea Act. But of course, Britons are much more concerned than what's just happening in America. Their empire happens to be global. And the East India Company is something that, as far as they're concerned, is too big to fail. And so tea is going to be a cornerstone, if you will, for kind of all the policy that goes forward when it comes to Americans.
Now, you also noted that Parliament was reassessing its plan, going back to the drawing board and marching troops into the colonies. Where exactly did Britain march its troops into the colonies, and how did British North America become militarized?
Well, I think you have one vivid image, and it's one image that we have. It's actually drawn by Paul Revere, of troops marching down the Long Wharf into Boston. And they're coming off of ships, and they came in drumming their drums, marching, intimidating the people around them, letting them know that what was happening would not stand. They were going to reimpose order. This was boots on the ground. The interesting thing is the particular boots they were. And this is, again, where it gets to the relationship between the two brothers. These were troops that were coming from Cork. These were troops that were paid and supported by the Irish Parliament. These were troops that George was trying to ensure Ireland would be sending to the rest of the empire with time. So even though at this particular point in time, Charles's duties now ran into trouble. Charles was dead. George's vision was still living on.
So it sounds like there was a direct connection between the Townshend duties and the American response to them and the Boston Massacre, which took place on March 5, 1770.
Oh, absolutely. Well, this is the troops that are going to be opening fire on those Americans at the time. And so the Boston Massacre, the commanding officer was a guy named Preston. He was Irish. Many of the troops themselves were Irish too. These were the guys that George was responsible for raising in Ireland, and they're going to be the ones that are going to be firing on Americans.
And do you see any other ways that the Townshend duties connected with the massacre, or was it just these troops on the ground?
Yeah, I do. I think at that particular point in time, the one thing that the Townshend duties do is because Americans begin connecting the dots then, is that anything that happens as far as Americans are concerned is part of some sort of grander design, even if it necessarily isn't.
Now, in 1774, Edmund Burke, looking back on the Townshend duties, gave a speech called American Taxation. And in that speech, Burke considered the passage of the Townshend duties to be a, if not the, critical moment in the transformation of the British imperial landscape. Why do you think that is, Patrick? Why did Burke think this about the Townshend duties?
I think Burke got it. He understood what the Townshend duties were ultimately about. You know, when they're first passed, he really doesn't necessarily see them that way. He was actually friends with Charles, and Charles was really good friends with his patron, Lord Rockingham. Burke also considered Charles Townshend to be about the most able statesman of the period, and he said sometimes he could really be dazzling. But later on, Burke, particularly looking from the vantage point of 1774, when everything had more or less fallen apart, when British sovereignty was just kind of a shadow of really what it had been at this point anyway. As he's looking back and doing the recent history of what had gone on, he says, yes, now I understand and see what this moment actually represented. It was the moment when innovation was introduced, and Dickinson got it right and understood what was happening, and I can see exactly what was going on and why this would surely infuriate Americans.
So we've been really concerned with the North American side of this story, and yet Patrick also spends a good portion of the Townshend Moment covering the way that the American crisis connected and intersected with the crisis in Ireland, and the ways in which Charles's brother George ended up having to deal with that crisis as the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. Patrick, I know this is a long, complicated history, but would you provide us with some of the highlights of how these two crises in North America and Ireland intersected and connected with each other during the 1760s and 1770s?
Well, we think of them as two different places, but I think that people at the time, certainly patriots on both sides of the ocean, consider these two places conjoined. And they thought, and this is another way these people are connecting dots, they're not just kind of connecting dots temporally, they're also connecting dots geographically, that they see what is going on as part of a design, but it's not just a part of the design to subjugate Americans. They see it as part of the design to subjugate all provincials. So what happens to George is exactly what happens to Charles, but in a much more vitriolic kind of way. Irish patriots more or less say exactly the same things that American patriots are saying at the time. What they see George trying to do, that he's trying to undermine Parliament and Parliament's autonomy in Dublin, they see that's indeed exactly what Charles is trying to do with the American assemblies. As he is trying to centralize power for the American colonies, George is trying to centralize power that'll subjugate Ireland in exactly that kind of way. So they see not only an intersection, they see these two histories as fundamentally conjoined at this particular kind of moment. And when Irish patriots look out, they understand their place relative to the things that are happening in America at the same time too. And I would say the same thing for Americans. As Americans are looking out, they're also looking at what's happening to Ireland and they're saying, oh my gosh, can you believe that? They're dealing with the same kinds of things we're dealing with. There was only one other difference, which is really interesting. When Americans looked at Ireland, they said, look, if we don't get our house in order, if we don't figure our way around this imperial crisis, they're going to turn us into Ireland. Ironically, the Irish are saying the same thing. They say, look, if we don't get our house in order, if we don't turn things around and figure out empire, how it's supposed to work, they're going to make us like Americans.
So when exactly did the Townshend Moment end?
I think the Townshend Moment ends by the time that George is able to accomplish all he wants to accomplish and the time that Charles's vision ultimately for America fails. But in many ways, it lives on. Like I said before, these two are not distinctive in any kind of way. Every British statesman that came along in this period of time also thought that he was up to the task and also thought that he had the vision and the ideas to try to reform empire at this moment of time. That to me is the interesting thing about it. As I say before, they were not exceptional, even though they thought themselves to be distinctive.
And why do you think the Townshend moment of the late 1760s is important for us to grapple with today? How does it help us better understand early American and British imperial history?
I think it's kind of one of these moments that we see over and over again. This to me is a story about global change and how people are trying to understand, conceive of, appreciate, and act on global change. And how sometimes when people try to control or manage that change, that can have revolutionary implications. I think that's the story of the American Revolution, how British statesmen at the time and Americans living an ocean away were all invested in the same project of trying to understand what had happened to the Atlantic in our lifetimes. How do we explain what this place is like, and how are we going to try to manage it as best as we possibly can? And this was the most exhilarating thing of the day, but how in an unintended way, this will have revolutionary implications.
Now let's jump into the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. In your opinion, what might have happened if Charles Townshend had lived to see his plan for empire implemented? Would British North America still have turned to revolution?
It's a great question. And although my crystal ball is sort of on the fritz, let me give it a shot. I'm going to go out there and I'm going to say this. I'd say we'd be carrying British passports. That's what I'm going to say. I would say, just based upon his abilities, if Charles was able to remain in control at Parliament, he would have come up, I think, with something really creative. Now, he could have reeled himself back and done something like a la Edmund Burke was going to suggest later on, like leave well enough alone, come up with another way of kind of dealing with empire or structuring empire. Maybe he would have said the vision that we have to have is one that John Dickinson is actually, and most Americans are subscribing to, because this would have seemed to him the most realistic path of going forward. On the other hand, I could see him kind of calling up his brother and saying, "Oh, George, what are we going to do?" George, being the one of the Iron Will, said, "What you need is more boots on the ground." I think he would have taken one course or the other. Either of those courses ultimately could have worked. Obviously, one more coercive than the other. But instead, the middle ground approach was taken. The middle ground approach didn't work.
That's a really interesting thing to consider, because one of the considerations during the War for Independence was that Britain never put enough boots on the ground to secure the colonies and the territory it would win back at battles.
That's right.
So what aspect of history are you working on now, Patrick?
Well, right now I'm writing For My Many Sins, a history of the age of Atlantic Revolution. So I'm playing upon some of these themes I've been working with and expanding them to the whole Atlantic and trying to understand what happened in the wake of the 7 Years' War to all of these societies that bounded the Atlantic. What were the broad issues that transfixed and also terrified all people at this time? What were the central features of revolution? And then most perplexingly, how revolutions all came to an end. And how do you have kind of an Atlantic that looks dramatically different in 1850 than, say, it looked in 1763? So that's what I'm working on at the moment.
What if we have questions about the Townshend moment? How can we get in contact with you?
Well, you can just go to the University of Notre Dame History website, History Department. There will be a link to my email there. There will also be a list of my principal publications, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Patrick Griffin, thank you so much for taking us through the Townshend moment and for helping us better grapple with the American Revolution.
My pleasure, Liz, and thank you for all the good work you do for our profession.
The Townshend moment was a many-faceted moment. It started after the French and Indian or 7 Years' War ended in 1763 and carried through the early 1770s. Britons all over the British Empire recognized this moment as an important time. It was a time of great hope and opportunity as the old world of the British Empire faded away and a new world for the empire emerged. But the emergence of this new world also proved to be a time of chaos and peril. Victory during the 7 Years' War saw a great expansion in the empire's territorial holdings. British trade in the Atlantic world had grown so large and so vast it had become unruly. Plus, victory in the war had come at a great cost. The national debt of Great Britain had nearly doubled, growing to roughly £137 million. And this was at a time when carrying a national debt was considered to be a bad fiscal policy. So ultimately, the Townshend Moment raised many questions for British imperial officials in London, such as, how do we efficiently govern our vast territorial holdings so that the empire can function as an efficient whole? Or, how can we rein in the vast amounts of smuggling and unofficial trade going on within the Atlantic so that we can harness its great potential and enrich the empire? Or, how do we enact plans to systematize and centralize imperial and economic governance without further bankrupting the government? These were questions Charles and George Townshend and other imperial officials grappled with. And where others had failed to come up with a viable plan to answer these questions, Charles and George Townshend believed that they had found a solution. Now, the Townshend Plan had 3 steps and 2 stages. The first step involved imposing a set of duties on goods that were manufactured in England and exported to North America. The thought was that the colonists would accept these duties as part of Parliament's right to regulate trade. The second step would come after the successful implementation of the first step. Once the duties generated revenue from the colonies, Parliament would then use said revenue to pay the salaries of its imperial officials in the colonies. This new payment plan from Parliament would remove these officials from the hold of the colonial legislatures, which, at that time, was responsible for paying their salaries. Finally, the third step would follow the second. Once the colony's imperial officials were in the pay of Parliament, these officials would be able to effectively implement and enforce parliamentary law and taxation, which would ultimately centralize the colony's governance within Parliament. Meanwhile, the second stage of the Townshend's plan involved George setting up a contingency plan. George understood that Parliament might need soldiers to enforce its will, so he planned for Ireland to raise and supply those troops. Now, both George and Charles Townshend believed that their plan would begin to create order and mitigate the peril of governing this newly enlarged British Empire. And on paper, it looked like a great plan, but in operation, the plan failed to work. The North American colonists pushed back against these measures by forming a coordinated non-importation movement. They politicized the Townshend Plan in such a way that all British goods came to be seen as bad for America and bad for Americans. Plus, their politicization didn't just stop with British goods. They came to see all government action as having a subjugating design behind it. And this was the context the Boston Massacre occurred in, and how the massacre came to be seen as a massacre. George Townshend's plan for Ireland to supply the troops Parliament needed to enforce its will worked. As soon as the Bostonians began to grumble over the Townshend duties, imperial officials in Massachusetts began to worry. Bostonians had conducted violent protests to resist the Stamp Act. What might they do to resist this plan to subordinate the colonies to the will of Parliament? Parliament took no chances. It sent in George's troops to keep the order and to enforce its will in Boston. For more than 16 months, as many as 2,000 troops occupied this town of about 20,000 people. There was no war, but there was resentment. And as Eric Kinderrocker revealed in episode 228, Bostonians often tried to provoke the soldiers by knowingly using the provisions in the Riot Act against them. Now, the Riot Act prevented the soldiers from acting against the colonists without civilian approval, which meant that they couldn't fire their weapons or really even keep the peace in Boston without civilian say-so. And no civilian magistrate would say so. So the troops just had to stand there and take it. The taunts, rocks, snowballs, and abuse from Bostonians until they didn't. So the Townshend Moment set the scene and context for the Boston Massacre. In fact, we can't really understand the massacre or the American Revolution without understanding this larger moment. So now we know the particulars of the massacre and the context that brought it about. That still leaves us with its memory and legacy to explore. And we'll do that next week in episode 230 with Mitch Kashun, who will take us through the creation and use of the Boston Massacre's memory and of the memory of its first victim, Crispus Attucks. You can find more information about Patrick, his book, The Townshend Moment, plus notes for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com /229. The Omohundro Institute has been the proud publisher of award-winning books since 1943. And now, the OI is offering you the chance to purchase any book from its large collection at a 40% discount. So visit benfranklinsworld.com/OI books, browse its titles, and when you find the books you'd like to add to your library, use your promo code 01DAH40 to save 40%. Again, that's promo code 01DAH40. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's Digital Projects team. Joseph Edelman, Kim Foley, Martha Howard, Emily Snev, Holly White, and Karen Wolf. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. Finally, Patrick sees the Townshend Moment as one of those events that we can see over and over again, as it's the story of global change and how people try to make sense and appreciate that change. Do you see any Townshend moments in our own present day or perhaps even in our more recent past? I'd love to know what you see, so email me, liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.